Hello. We meet today in English and a Canadian writer, a woman, a mother, who wrote a bestseller. It's not surprising at all. Her name is Ashley Audrain, and we are talking about Îndoiala in Romanian, The Push, the original title in English. Hello, Ashley.
Hi, how are you, Nadine? Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you for accepting to be my guest and our guest. It's an honor to talk to you and a great pleasure. And I have, as I was saying before we started, plenty of questions about your amazing book, which is tormenting me, about motherhood, about writing, about such a topic, about trauma, and about the very, very complicated and specific links between mothers, daughters, and all the generations before them. I wanted to start by quoting the motto of the book, but maybe we'll talk about it later, because my main question actually is, how did you think of such a topic for our readers who haven't read the book as yet? I'll just say in a few words that this is a book about the relationship between a mother and a daughter which is quite problematic, to say the least. Also, sometimes evil. This is a book with echoes from many, many classical horror movies. I'm talking about Rosemary's Baby, or we need to talk about Kevin, or The Exorcist. And the relationship between the two evolves in a very dramatic way. And at the same time, there is another story, a backup story, following the relationship of the mother in the book with her own mother, with her grandmother, and so on. So motherhood is something very, very complicated. It can be a trauma. It can be a blessing. It's the miracle of life. It's what women are meant for in some approaches. But it's also a very, very delicate balance between love and hate sometimes, and it can be a burden. How did you think of writing such a book with such parameters? I mean, this toxic relationship with a toxic daughter, and the fact that you are a mother yourself influenced your choice and your writing?
Yes, that's thank you for that introduction. I think you have captured the book so well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think where the book came from, or where the idea came from, why I wanted to, write a story like this that explores these themes. When I look back, I think there were sort of two reasons, or sort of two inspirations. And, the first was I had always really been interested in motherhood and the idea of motherhood, even as a young girl, like even as a teenager or, a young woman in my 20s. I always was so curious about it, and never in a way that I wanted to be a mother or I wanted to experience it, because for a long time I didn't think I would, or didn't think I had that maternal feeling to me or instinct in me. But I was more curious about it in the sense of wondering why women do it. Why do women decide to become mothers? What is the thing that makes them want it and changes their mind? How does it change them and their identity and their lives? And I was always surrounded, when I was younger, by women who were very positive mother figures. I have a very wonderful, loving mom, and my grandmother and aunts, and, my friends' parents. I mean, I remember seeing all of these examples in my life of women who really seemed like they loved motherhood, and they spent lots of time with the children, and they seemed to enjoy that. And a lot of them, that was kind of their whole lives. They didn't really have careers or anything else. So I had this very certain, image of what a mother was growing up. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I don't feel like that will ever be me. Like, I don't feel like that's the kind of womanhood that I have ahead of me. And I also remember thinking that it cannot possibly really be like that for everybody. And I knew that there were women, unlike the ones that I was surrounded by, who must regret it, and who must have, negative experiences with it, and who must not like their children. Like, I was very aware of that at a young age. And then when I did decide to become a mother myself, I really firsthand, experienced that huge difference, between how we are taught to think about motherhood, how we grow up learning it should be, the way we're supposed to speak about it, how we are supposed to portray it, and what it's really like. And I really realized that, and I could see this in, the people, my friends and who were having babies as well, that we all really were meant to make it look a certain way. And it actually didn't really feel like that for a lot of women most days, most times. And that was just so interesting to me. And I really wanted to explore that through fiction. I wanted to explore what would happen for one woman, if she did have to face all of the fears. And, when you and I were chatting earlier, you mentioned this idea of fear, about motherhood. And I think that's really what this book is. I think the book is really an exploration of fear and motherhood. And to me, fear is as much a part of motherhood as love is. And fear and motherhood, I think, are one and the same. And yet it is very difficult to talk about that, or talk about our fears, or explore them without feeling a sense of, guilt or shame, or, but I think that I sort of, took all of the fears that I had about motherhood and gave them to this character. The idea of regret, we are not supposed to regret the decision to have a child. The idea that you might not like who your child is in the world. And that is, a terrible thought. You feel like you are, meant to, not loving them is one thing, but not liking them or feeling like they're going to be a good person in the world is a terrible horror, of a thought as a mother. There's grief and loss, explored in this book, which I think is every parent's, worst fear. And so, yeah, I think, well, I didn't quite realize it at the time I was writing. I think now that looking back, I can really see that that's what this book is. Yeah. So that's where it all kind of started in my mind.
Mm-hmm. That's true. So it's the idea of the taboo. We're not supposed to say that maybe our lives were better before we had children. And it's very rare to find a parent who is so sincere to admit that. I have met people who have told me this, and I was very surprised, and I didn't judge them at all. I understood them completely, right, although I'm not a mother yet. But it was quite refreshing for me to have met them. Wow. I told them, you are so sincere and so brave to admit that out loud. So, and you mentioned fear. That's true. I was saying that all the fears I've ever had about being a mother, I've met them in your book, and that's tremendous, a tremendous feat for a writer to encompass all this. But also, it's about guilt, because we carry guilt from the previous generations, and it's true that through the maternal line, there's guilt coming from ages ago. And that's why I mentioned the motto, which is very beautiful. And it's from a book called When the Drummers Were Women, talking about the goddesses and about ancient times. It's like you say here very beautifully. I mean, the idea that you put here as a motto is that the history of who we are, and especially for us women, comes back from who we were in the wombs of our mothers and so on. And it's like we carry not only the genetics, but the history of all the suffering and of all the happiness that happened to our mothers and grandmothers and ancestors before us. How did you deal with this idea of guilt, of carrying? Because when you carry your child, you kind of carry all this as well. And it's this degree of uncertainty, because you don't know how your child will be. Of course, you hope for the best, but you never know. And it's this balance between, I'm so happy that I'm going to give life, to give birth, and then I'm so scared that life might not be what I expected it to be.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that is so much a part of, I think, the experience of having a child, and so much a part of this book, what I wanted to write about in this book. And, yeah, I loved that quote that you just referenced at the beginning of the book, this idea that, you put it so eloquently, but yeah, it's that idea that especially as women, especially when we are pregnant with a female child, we are carrying the eggs of our future grandchildren in us. And it's a fascinating biological fact that I don't think any of us think of. I certainly didn't think of that when I was pregnant with my daughter. But it is such an interesting thing. And I love what you said about, that idea that we don't really know, who our children are going to be or what we are carrying forward in them. And I think that that's part of that, that question that's explored here. And I have always found it so interesting that, we don't really know who our children are going to be. We can't possibly know. It is really one of the biggest mysteries of life, is to bring another life into the world and have no idea who that person is going to be, but to do it anyways, to commit to raising them anyways, and commit to loving them, and commit to, all of the commitment we make, as parents is to this unknown being. And I think that sort of as a society, we try to sort of convince ourselves that we have quite a bit of control over who that person is. I speak firsthand from this with my two children, really believing that you can have a significant influence on them. And of course you can, but there are certainly instances where you cannot. It comes down to that question of nature versus nurture, and, what we pass along in our genes and our DNA, and what is there in that child, that it just is, and what we can change or, influence, what they learn from us, in the way that we treat them and the way that we behave. And I just think that's one of the most interesting questions, about reproducing or about having a family, is just that unknown. And yet we do it anyways, we do it anyways under this understanding, this false understanding, again, that we can have this kind of influence and control. And so we really do see that in this story with, Blythe has this daughter, Violet, and she starts to see these qualities, in this child that she really feels like she can't do anything about. She really feels like this is just the way the child is, but she certainly struggles with how much of it is her own projected anxiety, how much of it is her, not being able to see her daughter any other way because she is so aware and conscious of this past, that she carries. And so there is a lot of that in this book, of this, back and forth, and this sort of ambiguous thinking of, what is really, what have I passed down to this child? Who is she really? Versus, how is my mothering of her changing her, or how is my mothering of her damaging her? And I think that that's something that, obviously this, with Blythe and Violet, it is an extreme case of that. You mentioned good and evil and that whole question. But I think we all experience that in some ways when we have a child, sort of watching your child and thinking about the ways that you were raised or that your parents treated you, and how you are then either trying to break that cycle or not, and I think we all, you can't, when you're a parent, you really can't help but think of that. You can't help but think of, compare what you are repeating and what you are trying to do differently. And it really makes you kind of stop and have to really take stock, of yourself and the way you were influenced. And it is sort of that chain reaction of generations, and so that, I think that's really why, eventually I sort of built in, as you mentioned, this sort of backstory of Blythe's mother and Blythe's grandmother. It was almost like as I was writing Blythe, I couldn't really understand who Blythe is as a mother and as a woman, unless I understood who her mother was as a mother and a woman. And so then developed her backstory. And then I sort of had the same feeling where I wanted to know how her mother was raised and what mother she came from. And then started writing about the grandmother story as well. And so we really kind of see this chain of generations of women in the book.
Well, it's true that psychologists say that you cannot understand your parents unless you know their childhood and you know their parents and how they were raised. And you have to go back in time and understand their traumas. And some of them were transmitted to you and some others are new ones. So it's very, very delicate and very difficult. But I also thought that Blythe is a mystery because she's a woman, she's a mother, she's a wife, she's a lover. She has her own anxieties, but at the same time, she's also struggling to be someone good and to be a good mother. But on the other hand, Violet is very interesting as a character and also unsettling. How did you picture her? It's the problematic child, but a child who goes beyond being problematic. There are certain facts that Blythe doesn't imagine they exist. Like, I don't want to spoil too much of the action of the book, but maybe you can tell us more.
Yes. She is a really interesting character. I mean, she is a little girl, through most of the book. And I really, she's a very dark character and a dark little girl. And I think in the same way that I was sort of giving Blythe these sort of fears about motherhood, she was really a character sort of born out of the fears of who your child might be. And I think what's so unsettling about her, or what I wanted to be unsettling about her, is that she's, in some ways, she seems like any other, normal little girl, in a sense that, she goes to preschool and she has a very strong connection with her father. We see that she can be very, loving and playful and sweet. And she does, really seem to love him, and the grandmother loves her. And, she has these other connections in her life that make you think that, she is capable of love and empathy and all of the things that she is. And yet, we see that there is a huge disconnect, between her and her mother, the person she should love the most, the person she should have the strongest connection with. And I think as a reader, Blythe is our narrator, and we are seeing this whole story through her eyes, very tightly through her perspective on this story. And so as the reader, we trust that Blythe is telling us her truth, her story, but we don't know the whole truth as the reader. And so there is a lot about, Violet, that we might, I think in the back of the reader's mind, they're sort of thinking, well, what does everyone else think about her? And how does everyone else feel about her? But we never really know. And so I think it creates this space for doubt. And then, yes, you're right. We do then see, very factual things that happen that kind of show us, who she is. And yet there is still this kind of, push and pull between her and her mother. And, it's interesting because I think as a society, we are very uncomfortable, I think, with the idea that a child can do something that feels evil, or that feels so unthinkable. And but yet, of course, we know that is possible. We know that there are children who behave in ways that we would never imagine them to, or ways that feel evil, but it's such an uncomfortable thing for all of us. And I think it comes back to that idea that it could be our child, and it kind of really questions that idea of the innocence that we love to think about associated with childhood. And that's just interested me as well. And I think that we can all, like, people have asked me before, is Violet based on anybody that I've known? And no, she isn't. Thankfully, she's not based on any of my children, or at least that I know of yet. They're still young. I guess there's time. But I think that I do remember, though, being a child. I don't know if you remember this, but I've had other people say this as well. I think we can remember from our childhood, there was always one or two children that made me uncomfortable. There was, like, at school or in the playground or wherever. Like, sometimes I think, especially when we're young and we're feeling very intuitive, and we don't have that societal message about, children not being able to do evil, in our minds. I can remember being a child and feeling a little frightened or sort of spooked or uncomfortable about the way certain children behaved and sort of the energy they had. And so I think that I've sort of I was thinking a little about that while I was writing Violet as well. And we sort of see that she has some encounters with other children that sort of make you feel like, she's definitely the one that they're all looking at being like, oh, that kid is, a little scary. So I think that's an interesting dynamic too.
Yeah, she's very interesting as a character, and very difficult to write, I think, because it's difficult to write evil characters and not make them flat. And especially with children, because children are like unidimensional because they are small and innocent, and what can you say about them? They just play and they are cute and that's it. But no, here we have several layers of that. Now, about Blythe, you mentioned the fact that we don't know if she's trustworthy or not. The unreliable narrator is a very, very good topic for a psychological thriller. And I was thinking that starting with Nabokov and then going to Ishiguro, and then later on in books like Gone Girl or The Girl on the Train, we deal with unreliable narrators. Is it difficult to write such a character? Do you write it on purpose just to keep the suspense and have cliffhangers all the time at the end of each chapter? Because we don't know for sure, is she imagining things? Is she just tired? She's suffering from postpartum depression. Maybe she's evil herself and we don't know this. But in the end, things are clarifying. So I mean, there's light at the end of the book. Yeah. Well, maybe the light we wouldn't have expected or we wouldn't have wished for, but still, it's like we understand her better. How did you think about her when you were building the character and the plot?
You know, I'm so glad that you put it that way, because even though I always knew she was, you know, this character that readers would question, I always, from the very beginning, even though, you know, I didn't really know what was going to happen in the book when I started writing, but I always knew how I wanted the reader to feel about her at the end. And it's exactly what you've just expressed, which is that she has even though she is unreliable in a certain way to us, she has a moment of validation, you know, at the end. And that was important to me, that, you know, the reader is on this journey with her, which is sometimes, you know, fraught and painful and difficult. I felt like at the end, I needed to give her a moment with the reader so the reader could really see, you know, who she really was and sort of what was happening, while still being a bit ambiguous, you know, while still having some questions. So yeah, you know, it's interesting when I think about her, for a long time, I didn't really think about her as such an unreliable narrator. And although she certainly is. And I think the reason is because in some novels, we get an unreliable narrator who we feel like he or she is holding back information from us, you know? And as the reader, we're just sort of waiting for the author to kind of, you know, tell us more about what that character really knows. But I think in Blythe's case, we know we are getting her truth because she's giving us so many intimate details, and we're put right in the middle of this marriage. And so I think that the reader sort of feels like Blythe is being honest with them, but it's her truth. You know, it is very much her story, her side of the story, you know, as she says at the beginning of the book. And so she's unreliable in a bit of a different way, in a sense that we don't really know what is true, but that's sort of how life works, right? Where we all have our own version of the truth and of the way things happen and of our lives. And somebody else in our sphere in that same experience might have a completely different perspective on how things were. And I think that that's where the unreliability comes from, you know, in that, you know, we get such an intimate view from her, such a tight perspective from her. And we know there's more to the story. We're just not really sure what it is. But Blythe is really telling us, you know, her side of things and what she believes. And so it was just so interesting to write a character from that perspective. And the other thing I loved about writing her in this sort of, you know, category of kind of her side of the story and being unreliable, and us really trying to understand, you know, was some of this in her head or was this really true, is that, you know, the book is told in this sort of hybrid second person voice. And so in the book, she is speaking to somebody specifically, and it's this sort of memoir or missive, you know, of sorts that she is giving to her husband, Fox. And so we are sort of reading, you know, her account of their life for him, to him specifically. And so we sort of feel like readers sort of feel like they're dropped right in the middle of this marriage. And there's that tension between two people, and the tension of the sort of triangle of their family, you know, of the daughter and the husband and the wife. And so, yeah, I loved telling the story that way. I really loved us being in her head, but speaking to him, because I think when you're speaking to somebody, I mean, we can all relate to this in life. Like if you're writing a letter or you're speaking directly to somebody, you almost like recount things or speak about things in a different way than you would, you know, to somebody else. Like the tone of your thoughts and how you're communicating things and the details you bring up. I think those would have been hard to capture in this book if it was, you know, third person or first person. It really had to be what she needed to tell him, you know, about their family. Yeah,
that's a very clever device, and there are very few books, successful books, in the second person. because it's very hard to carry the book like this. But that gives the book dynamic, and the dynamic part and the action, and also it involves him. And I have two questions here, and I don't know which one to ask first. So I'll go with the flow of the discussion. So since this is a book addressed to him, what is the role of the male, of the man in the story? Because he's the father, and of course he has this great relationship with the daughter. She's kind of a daddy's girl, and he believes his wife, but at the same time he has this doubt that maybe his wife is not the perfect mother. He's not reproachful, but he's kind of holding back. And after some time, he finds somebody else, and there's this cycle of suffering, which is triggered by him as well. So how did you think about him? What is his position in between all of these women? So even his new wife is a woman. So yeah.
Great question. It's a really good question, because he does play a really important role. And, you know, a lot of, as I sort of had mentioned about being in the marriage, that was a really just important part of this book for me. You know, it wasn't, I think from the very beginning, it was never just a story about motherhood. It was the story about motherhood, you know, in a marriage, in a very specific marriage, and how much that partner, that person that you have that child with, how much they influence you and impact the experience of raising a child, how important that decision is, you know, about who you have that child with. I mean, I think all of that is sort of, you know, layered here. And I think what's, you know, Fox is a, you know, no, every reader has seemed to really loathe Fox. You know, he is not the most likable man in the world, to put it mildly. He is very difficult, and, you know, somebody that, you know, you wouldn't want to be in a relationship with, of course. However, we see at the beginning how they fell in love and why they fell in love, and everything that Fox gives Blythe at the beginning, which is the hope and promise for the kind of family she's always wanted, you know, the kind of family that she never had. And so he gives her all of this promise at the beginning. And so we can really understand, you know, why they fall in love. And where things go wrong, which, you know, I think that there's a lot of women who unfortunately can relate to this, is that he had certain expectations of who she should be as a mother to their children, and certain expectations of who she should be as a wife in the family. And when Blythe couldn't meet that, you know, when Blythe could not, you know, match his expectation of her, he turns on her. You know, he almost doesn't want to know her or see her in any other way. Like, he has only made space for her as this perfect mother like his, you know, and we meet his mother, the mother-in-law named Helen. We meet her in the book, and we really see how she is this perfect, smiling mother who's, you know, if there's any problem, she sort of sucks it up and moves on. And, you know, she even tells Blythe, like, you have to have, you know, a stiff upper lip about this. You have to just, it's hard, and you have to just be the best mom you can. And that's her advice to Blythe when she sees that Blythe is struggling. And that's what Fox wants. And we know why. It's because he's been taught that from his mother, and he's been taught that from society. This is how motherhood looks. This is how a loving mother should act. This is how a mother should feel about her child. All of that has been taught to him in the same way that it's taught to women. And so it is so inconvenient for him when she can't be this, that he almost ceases to see her as the woman she was before. Like, he doesn't see her as this lover anymore, or as this, you know, the woman that he once did. He just wants her to perform. And I think that, you know, I've heard from readers, you know, women who've read the book who have said, like, they can recognize that feeling, you know, that feeling of having to show up a certain way every day because somebody in that house is expecting you to, whether or not, you know, you feel that way or not. So I think he sort of is this foil, you know, he is this sort of contrast to the character of, you know, Blythe, and they both want they both want the same thing for their family. But Blythe just can't get there, and he's not willing to help her, you know, any other way. And he sort of gaslights her and doesn't want to hear her truth. So he does become a very frustrating character, and somebody who readers definitely, you know, are uncomfortable with. And so he sort of, you know, starts one place and ends up another in the book. Yeah.
I think it's also frustrating to think that for men it's easier. So it's a cliche, but it's true that a woman has to carry the child, and there's this bond which is being formed long before the man gets to see the baby. And not even then, for a man, it's not the same thing. It's like, I've heard men say that, well, for us, it's just a simple thing. It's not like we bond with the child later on when the child is born and when it grows and we can see him or talk to him, then it becomes real. But for a woman, it's been real for a long, long time. So my other question was, have you thought of your children reading the book when they grow up and asking you questions? So what was this about, Mommy? It's like, have you thought of how this book, I mean, not the book, but the setup in the book can be interpreted or can raise questions not about you personally, but about the things that can cross your mind? Of course, you're a writer, and a writer has this right of appropriating the world and making the world his or her. But at the same time, it's like this idea that we don't know for sure from where the inspiration comes. And sometimes a writer himself or herself doesn't know. So are you prepared for such questions like, was it about us or was it about you?
It's such a good question. I have thought of that. And, it's very funny because I guess I have a few thoughts on it. One funny anecdote is that a week ago, my son was still in school. He's in kindergarten, and they're all doing it virtually, on the computer with his class. And they have these whiteboards, and the teacher will ask them to draw certain things, and they have their, markers, and they draw them, and then they show them to the class, and then they post them on this app for the parents to see. And the teacher had said to them, draw something that makes you feel love. And I was, off in another room. My son was sitting here in the kitchen doing school, and he drew, he's 6, and he drew a picture of the book, and he wrote the title, which in the English editions is The Push. And so he wrote The Push, and he drew the whole book in detail and did the cover. And that was what he posted for things that make you feel love. And I thought that was so sweet because, and also kind of funny because he recognizes that book as being important to our family and important to me. And when I saw it after, I said, oh my gosh, why did you choose the book as the thing that makes you feel love? And he said, oh, because you wrote it, which was so sweet. Like I will always remember him doing that. It was such a lovely, perspective from him, on the book. And then after we were sort of laughing, thinking, well, if he knew what the book was about, he might not feel that way. But of course, it's not, it is not, it really is not autobiographical in any sense, other than the fact that, that I think that where the idea, as I was describing earlier in our conversation, where the idea came from, I think is a very honest reflection on the fears of motherhood and how difficult it can be, especially in that first year. And so I think, I actually hope that I have a daughter as well. I mean, she's only 3 now, but I really hope what the book does is really help to kind of break that thinking about motherhood for her, and for my son. But I hope that it always is this, ever-present kind of conversation for us, once they are old enough to read the book and understand it and process it, about what motherhood is really like, because I really think that we are not really doing, the next generation a service if we continue to kind of uphold this structure of what motherhood has to look like and what it has to be like, and even that you should have children, and even that, so I hope it really helps us to have honest conversations that question the narrative that we put on women. And so in that way, I hope it is, useful in that sense of kind of how they see the world and how they think about themselves as people in the world who may or may not, decide to have children. But yeah, it'll be quite a long time before they read it, I'm sure. But I think, I also, the other part of me also feels like there's so little. And by the time that I feel like this book might just end up being this thing that mom did, that nobody really cares about by the time that they're, teenagers. But yeah.
Well, we never know. They might read it next year. Who knows? But
It's true. You never know.
since you mentioned the cover, what's your son's name? Oh, what are the names of your children?
Oscar. My son's name is Oscar. Yeah, and my daughter's name is Waverly. Yeah.
Waverly and Oscar. That's lovely. So Oscar drew this, which is the Rorschach test, and it's quite complicated to draw at any age. But I thought it was a great cover. It is a great cover because it puts things into perspective, meaning it puts you into a mirror. So as a parent, we know now that there is no perfect family. There is no perfect parent. There are always mistakes. Some are hidden, some are in your face, but the hidden ones are the dangerous ones because you don't know them. So speaking of the Rorschach test, are there things that you found out about yourself after you became a mother, or about being a parent and now you understand better your parents or their parents, or what happened when you were a child, and now you can tell your mother, for instance, well, now mom, I know for sure what you meant when you did or said that?
Yeah, well, that's such a good question. Yeah, I think, I mean, there's sort of two things come to mind. The first is, I had a lot of trepidation, going into motherhood. I wanted to do it, but I wasn't really sure. And I was I sort of wanted to become a mother because I was worried that I would regret it if I didn't. It was that was sort of more why I sort of chose to do it. And so I always sort of expected that I might have this kind of fraught relationship with it, and didn't know how I would sort of feel. And I think what I've learned is that, it's sort of cliche, but how much you really do love, I really do love them dearly. And I don't regret it for a second. I really love motherhood. For sure, it is like the best part of my life. But also with that, there are days when I don't like it. And I think that that's the honest part that we don't talk about, or we sometimes are afraid to admit. And you can love your children dearly and treasure them, and be so happy that you have them, and all of those things that we hope to feel, and we probably do feel. But you can still have a day where you long for the life you had before, or you can still have a day where you wish you didn't have the responsibilities that come along with being a mother. I mean, that's the reality. I think that's how a lot of women feel. And I think that both of those things can exist at the same time. And it doesn't make you less of a mother or not a good mother, or but they are very hard things for some women to say out loud and to admit to other women. And so that, I think that's what's so interesting to me. And it's funny because I do look back on, my mom and our childhood, and I really did see her as this woman who loved it and was so committed to us and was with us all the time and made life fun and all of these things, and how lucky to have that childhood. But, now I can really realize that it obviously wasn't always like that. That was what she showed us, but there was never, a day when she, would have, and of course you wouldn't do this to a small child, but there was never a day when I could sort of feel like she wasn't all in. And I think that's a very hard thing to do. And so, so I think about that a lot, about, how our lives are structured and how I mother my children. And, for example, during the pandemic, at one point, I needed to be working and writing and promoting, this book, and it was so much. And at one point I just said to my partner, I just need to go to a hotel for 3 days. I just need to go to a hotel alone so I can think and process and work and all of that. And of course, he's very supportive of that. But, I didn't lie to my children. I didn't say to them, I'm going on a trip or something. I just said to them, I need a few days to myself to work, because that's what I have to do to feel better and to feel happy. And so having those conversations, those honest conversations, I think, and of course I want them to grow up understanding that, and totally getting that. So I think a lot of it kind of comes down to sort of the way we talk to our children and how we communicate what motherhood is really like, I think. And you can still do that and be loving and all the things that we are to our children. They can all exist at once, I think. And then the other thing I thought of when you were talking about that is the idea that I did start writing this book when my son was 6 months old, and so for me, and I'd always loved writing before then, but I had a whole nother career and I would sort of write, at nights and on the weekends, and it wasn't as big a part of my life, and I didn't pursue it, in the way that I pursued writing with this book. So for me, I really feel like my writing life and my life as a mother, started at the same time. They really are one and the same for me. They're sort of, in my mind, they are sort of intertwined completely. And I feel like, and what a wonderful thing. I feel like motherhood really gave me that gift of writing, of having this other side to me and feeling as creative as I do now, and putting this story in my mind and inspiring me in a different way, inspiring me to want to show up in the world differently, to really be the person I've really always wanted to be, which is a person who is a writer and who, writes every day. And sometimes I look back and I think I don't this book and this writing life I have now and this success is only because I am a mother. It is only because that was what the impetus was. That was what inspired this for me. And so I'm very grateful for that. And I think, I owe a lot to motherhood in that respect as well. Yeah, it's interesting.
I like what you're saying, that communication is the key with children. And if you raise them to understand you and to understand your own needs as a parent and as a mother, that's going to be great for them. And it's going to make them more empathetic and better persons and people wanting to care for the others and care for you as a parent as well. And that's going to be good later on for the relationship between parents and children. But also I thought that maybe communication is key for you, since you were a publicity director at Penguin.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I wanted to ask you about this side as well, since you crossed the line and now you're on the other side. So you've become a writer, but you're coming from this world. And it's a fascinating world to be with inside when you're not a writer as well. So how was it before you started writing? And did it help you that you were working for Penguin as well, meaning that you knew the book industry, you knew what are the trends, you had read so many novels in the making, and you knew how to present an author to the world. So it's, sometimes it can be more difficult to start something if you're in the middle of that universe. So how was it for you?
Yeah, it was, hugely helpful and informative, I think. So I worked as you said, a publicity director at Penguin Canada for a couple of years before I left to have my first child, and went on maternity leave. And so I didn't, once I had Oscar, my son, I didn't go back to work, but I started writing. So I was never at Penguin while I was writing the book. I sort of had this kind of distinct time where I wasn't going back to work, and so started this. But I think that you're so, for the first time when I started working in publishing, I was so immersed in that world, and I'd always loved books and loved reading. And so going to work, every day at Penguin was like being a kid in a candy store. It was like books everywhere and authors everywhere. And I loved it. I really loved it. And I think that what I learned was really through reading. Like, I think when you work in publishing, you have to read so much. I read more books during those years, than I ever had before, and years before. And I was reading very widely as well, and different kinds of books. And I was reading, I was sort of, before I was a kind of person who read a lot of the same kind of book, and like would stick to the same kind of genre or the same kind of authors all over and over again. And really working in publishing, you're sort of forced to read far more commercial, than you might otherwise, and also far more literary and in, different genres. And you really, that is an education as a writer for sure. Because you are reading with a different lens and you're thinking about the books a little differently. And so looking back, I can see that was a huge education for me. And I really took a lot away from that, so that when I sat down to write, I just had more experience as a reader. And I think that really influences your writing. And then, I really, during the years that I was writing, I really kind of left that publicity brain sort of behind, in that other job. I think because everything had changed so much. Like, I had kids and was writing, and life was just so different. And I think there were times when I was writing, perhaps earlier on, when I was a little more, or sort of in the middle, actually, I think, of writing, when I was a little more aware of exactly what you're speaking about, like the trends and other books that are selling. Like around that time when I was writing, Girl on the Train had just come out. And of course, Gone Girl had already been out, but there was that whole genre of domestic suspense or the domestic thriller was really having a moment, while I was writing this book. And so I think for sure there were times when I remember feeling like, okay, I need more to happen. I need more twists. I need more suspense. I need it to be more of a, page turner. And I think I probably went about it the wrong way because I was trying to be like other books at that time. And thankfully that those drafts never survived. At one point I went back and sort of took all of that out and just really focused on the book I really wanted to write, which was this book about motherhood that did turn out to be, suspenseful in its own way. So yeah, I think it's almost impossible not to be influenced in some way by what's happening in publishing and what you're reading. It all kind of is part of sort of what's on your mind. And then I think in terms of being in publicity, I think now that I'm on this other side, as of January, when the book came out into the world, I do remember I was preparing authors for this same thing, about how to talk about your book and how to do an interview and like all of this stuff. And so now looking back, it kind of makes me laugh a little because I feel like sometimes I would give advice to, authors. And now I think like, now I know how hard it is, and that's not so easy to, be speaking about your book in certain ways or in certain, especially at the beginning, I think, especially at the beginning. Or I remember we would say to authors, or I would say to authors, like, not to worry about the reviews and don't worry about them and don't read them. And it's only one person's opinion, and now I'm like, oh, like, of course you're going to read, a review. And if one person's opinion feels like, very important. So yeah, it's funny.
Well, but
I'm happier on this side.
I think you should keep the same advice for you as well. So if it worked for the other writers, it's gonna work for you too, because you are a pro giving the pieces of advice to a pro. So from one side to the other. Well, it's a fascinating conversation, and I have just 100 more questions, but I'll just, if you allow, I'll just have two more.
Yeah, of course, I'm happy to.
The time, because time is running out. So
no problem.
One question is about the title. So the push, yeah. Of course, without revealing too much, but it's quite intriguing because, as I was saying, in Romanian, it was translated with the doubt, which is kind of it's putting you on a track. You think of something, oh, we're doubting her sanity or what's happening, but the push is kind of mysterious. In English, I think the reader asks himself, what is the push? I mean, what can be also the metaphor behind it?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I really like the title, The Doubt, as well. But the title, The Push, it's interesting. For a very long time, the book did not have a title when I was working on it. So while I was, writing it for 3 years or whatever, it was just called Untitled, saved on my desktop. Like I just couldn't commit to a title, and I wanted to come up with the right one. And it wasn't coming to me. I couldn't think of anything. And then right before I was about to send the book to agents, I realized it needs to have a title. Like I should call it something before I send it out. And so I had kind of spent like a few weeks sort of, quietly kind of just brainstorming, with myself, kind of thinking of something. And I couldn't come up with it. And then one day I was just doing housework, like I was, tidying up the house or something. And then the idea of the push just came to me out of nowhere. Like it was almost as though some little creative fairy just came and like gave my brain the title. And I remember thinking like, oh, that it works on so many levels. And that is, it just felt so right to me. I mean, there is, I think the idea of the push of labor, it is very much a story, of course, about, motherhood. And there is a scene of 2 scenes of labor in the book. And I love the idea of that push of a baby, into the world. And then also I think the idea of kind of pushing through motherhood and really having to get through the darker, harder days that every single mother experiences, that idea of kind of the pushing through all of that. And then of course there is a physical push in the book, connected to the plot. And so So from that, so it worked on so many levels, I think, especially the physical push and kind of the push of labor. And I've had some readers in book club conversations and stuff kind of say to me other connotations that they felt the push referred to. And a lot of people, a lot of readers don't get the meaning right away until like after. And it's been fun to kind of see readers kind of make the connection of the different push references, in the book, like we're talking about. So yeah, I just felt like it worked. And then of course, because I have worked in publishing, I know very well that often a publisher changes the title of a book. And very often the title that the author submits the book, or the title of the book when the author first goes out with it, ends up being changed because they want it to be more marketable, or the sales team doesn't like it, or, there's all these different reasons that a title gets changed. And so I sort of had always hoped that they wouldn't change it, that everyone liked it and they would keep it. And thankfully they did. All the publishers kept it if it worked if it translated in their language, or if it in English, obviously it works well. And then a lot of other languages, other editions changed it because it doesn't quite translate the same way in some languages, as you know. Yeah. And so there's been some other really great titles. The Doubt is a great one. A lot of countries are languages used The Instinct, which is another great title. So yeah, I was lucky with the titles. They've all been good.
It's good that you were willing to accept another offer, so another title.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe that's the perk of working in a publishing house and knowing your battles, what to fight.
Yes, you're exactly right. You have to pick your battles for sure. And you really realize that the people doing the work professionally usually know what they're talking about more than the author. So yeah.
So, there's something we haven't mentioned so far, forgiving. So forgiving yourself, forgiving your parents, forgiving your child, that's very difficult to handle. But I think that parents usually forgive their children more often than vice versa. Only when the children become parents themselves do they understand so much as to forgive their own parents. Because as I was saying, there are no perfect families or perfect parents. We always make mistakes as parents or as children. So it's important to have this in mind, that the possibility of forgiving exists beyond everything.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, tell me. Sorry.
I was just going to say that, of all the interviews that I've done, or all the conversations I've had over the past 6 months, nobody has brought up forgiveness. You're the first person to kind of bring that up. And I think it is so insightful, because forgiveness is very much a question in this book. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
The question is, how is it possible, or can one forgive? Is forgiveness possible? Is forgiving possible? Because it's like, when you think about it, it's very, very hard. And there are always things that pull you back and push you back. And you just feel like sometimes you are not able to, but you have to somehow. And the characters in your book also have to forgive. Violet has to forgive herself, and that's very tough. Blythe has to forgive her. Blythe has to forgive herself, her mother as well. And it's like an endless row, an endless circle, never ending, with what we feel and what we think about our parents or about our children. That's interesting because it's food for thought. So that's why it was so unsettling for me to read this, because it raises so many questions. But not to make it very heavy, I'll just ask you one last question about a movie. If you see it being made, or if you're debating this right now, the movie rights for the book, and who would you see as the main actors for Blythe, for Fox, for Violet, for the characters in the book?
Oh yeah, yes. So it's going to be made into a television show, into a limited television series, and there was some kind of discussion about, should it be a movie or should it be a TV series? And I really love the idea of an adaptation to television. And I think that's because, I think just selfishly, I love these very bingeable TV series that are on right now on, the streamers like Netflix and Amazon Prime and HBO and all of that. So I've loved so many of the book to screen adaptations that we've seen recently, like Normal People from Sally Rooney and Little Fires Everywhere from Celeste Ng, and, Big Little Lies from Leon Moriarty, of course. And so I would love to give viewers or readers that experience of kind of that 6 to 8 kind of episode bingeable experience. But the other reason I think too is because, I think that one thing that has been on my mind with the screen adaptation is I think it's very easy, to go into the territory of seeing Blythe and the other mothers in this book as sort of this trope of a bad mother on screen, And so often I think the portrayal of motherhood on screen, and in books too, but on screen, is you're one end or the other. You are like the perfect mother, or you're like this crazy unhinged mother. And Blythe is neither of those things. She is somewhere in the middle. Like I think we all are. We all are sort of somewhere in the middle. And so I really felt it was important that there was room for some of the nuances, to really show Blythe's character and why she is the way she is, and her history and what has happened. And I just sort of felt like it brought me more comfort to think of that on, 6 or 8 hours of screen, as opposed to a movie, which is, just shorter if there's just less time to work with. And so the producer who is working on is doing the project is David Heyman, who's a producer out of the UK, who did all the Harry Potter films, but also did Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Marriage Story. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's on Netflix. It's wonderful. And some other really cool projects. And they just had such a wonderful vision for The Push as a TV series. And they really wanted to keep a lot of the empathy, in the story for the women here. And they also felt it was very important that they find a woman screenwriter, which I think is also important. And so, it seems to be moving along. So we'll see. I mean, fingers crossed that it all kind of goes well, but it will be exciting for sure. Yeah. And then in terms of who I see, I've had a really hard time picturing what actress or what actors would play. I really don't know. I'm really excited for that. I'm excited to see, the direction that it takes, but I don't know. I've had a hard time kind of pinpointing exactly who that would be. But yeah, that'll be a very fun part of the process. So we'll kind of see what happens over the next year or so with the development.
Well, fingers crossed, and we look forward to seeing it and watching it. So yeah, and to reading your next books.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Working away on the second one now. I'll see how. Yeah.
Well, so we'll have other interviews in the future about your.
Oh, I would love to.
Me too.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful, thoughtful interview. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. And see you soon then.
Okay. Thanks, Nadine.
Goodbye.
Okay, take care. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.